you're in good company, right? We have them with chess. Yet another year, right? And we try to prevent to have the third year, right? In remotely. So it's
so hopefully next year we'll be all back to our old good days. So
hopefully, yeah. Everybody's boosted up then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I see people entering still massively.
Yeah, no, we can wait a few minutes. That's fine. That's fine.
I think that's fine.
I don't think I'm talking for a whole hour. It's probably more like 45 minutes. So we have, or 40 minutes. So we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good.
So we are also maintaining a Slack channel, and if there are any questions, then I think the volunteers will post the questions here.
Oh, that would be, yeah, I'm not on that Slack right now. I'm sorry. Yeah, if somebody could post it and just ask me.
It will be taken care of, so we will take care of it.
Yes, and we will read the questions later. So that's
okay. Yeah. So the two of you, if you could communicate also, if if people have urgent questions in between, it's perfectly fine to interrupt me, right? That's fine. Whatever makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I start with introduction. Good. Okay, so welcome everyone for this day 2 in our space conference. And I'm very happy to introduce our keynote, our first keynote today. It's Christof Paar, who almost, he needs no introduction, but if I start giving one, it's going to take a while. But anyway, I think I will at least say a few words on Christof's impressive path until now in both academia and industry. So Christof did his PhD in 1994 in the Institute of Experimental Mathematics in Essen. And if you were around the last few minutes, you probably heard quite a bit about our both paths. But yeah, anyway. Later, after that, he spent time at WPI in Massachusetts and then also with the Ruhr University Bochum. At the moment, he is a founding director at the MPI, as you can see on his first slide, Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy in Bochum, and also affiliated professor at the UMASS Amherst in the US. His research interests are very broad. It's basically everything around embedded security. So crypto engineering, hardware trojans, reverse engineering, physical layer security, security of cyber physical systems, and so on. He's also one of the spokespersons of the excellence cluster called CASA, cybersecurity in the age of large scale adversaries, which is based in Bochum. Christof also co-founded a company, well-known company called Script, a leading system provider in embedded security, which was later on acquired by Bosch. And for us academics, also interesting that he co-founded CHESS, Cryptographic Hardware and Embedded System Conference, which is the ISCR flagship conference for crypto hardware, and also research on side channel attacks and things like that. And that was already in 1999. And yeah, still going strong, just yeah, not being physical for a few years as many other conferences, but we hope to come back in 2022. Yes, without further ado, Christof, the floor is yours. I leave you to introduce also your topic.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm embarrassed, Lejla. You're very, very generous. Yeah. Okay, so I do have to apologize for my hoodie, which is rather informal, but this old hoodie has a chess logo on it. So I thought that might be fitting. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation. So I have maybe a somewhat unusual title, which is Political and Technological Issues of Hardware Security. The unusual part of that is, I guess, this is political, maybe a little bit of background. So one of the probably the main research thrust in my group over the last 5 years or so has been hardware Trojans, and that will be the main part of my talk. But then 2 or 3 years ago, I had a buddy at Harvard and said, Christof, why don't you give a talk? But he was not connected to the techies there, but to the Harvard Kennedy School, which is a world famous school for political science, right? And you get all kinds of different people together. And then he said, Christof, don't give your nerdy techie talk, right? So explain a little bit. And it was a small audience, it was maybe 40 people, and there were like, people from the military and historians, sociological people, and some computer scientists and engineers and mathematicians like us. But that was a good push for me to look really in this, what has there been in previous work, what is kind of the historical political context. So, and actually I really enjoyed preparing that talk, and now I'm kind of want to start with that. Okay, so yeah, so there are 4 main chapters, if you wish, to my talk. First, I want to give a little bit introduction to hardware Trojans, how I look on that, which is maybe the most pressing part of hardware security, or an important part. And then comes this historic perspective, which I find quite instructive, gets you a little bit of feeling what's at stake. And then chapters 3 and 4, so to speak, I'm going to give you 2 case studies that maybe highlight kind of the threat potential and what can be done with hardware Trojans, right? So it's designing stealthy low-level Trojans 1 and 2. Okay, but let's first start with the introduction to hardware Trojans. Okay, so first the definitions. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? If you're in security, right? So this is some kind of malicious alteration to an integrated circuit, so that you change the functionality, but not in a pleasant way, right? You're not making your smartphone using less energy because of a hardware Trojan, but because people maybe want to wiretap, violate your privacy. I want to steal money from you, right? From your PayPal account, right? So the next question is, why would anybody do that? Well, there are many unpleasant applications. I put that in quotation marks because application is now speaking from an adversary's point of view, right? So why would a bad person do that, right? So the standard example, and you'll see that on the next couple of slides, this whole area of hardware Trojans really started with a report by the US Department of Defense, the DoD. And like a standard example that's being given is, you order, if you like the Indian military or German military, US military, you buy a drone for whatever. I'm making up a number, 30 million euros or $10 million or whatever, right? Or 100 million rupees. And it works perfectly fine unless that drone is flying over Germany, because the German engineers injected a hardware Trojan in the GPS chip, right? Which is virtually impossible to detect. And as soon as the drone is flying over Germany, it stops operating. It crashes or it doesn't fire or whatever, right? So, and US military is very worried about that, as is many other governments, right? Maybe a more, let's put it, European view on that is also is our physical infrastructure, right? So this picture is supposed to symbolize the smart grid. We know, the grid, if it's smart, it really depends on digital technology, but even the standard grid is totally controlled by remotely in computers, right? So it would be very unpleasant if, let's say, an external actor, like an external government, would take control of our physical infrastructure, right? And maybe selectively shuts off the power supply in certain areas of the country, right? And then closer to home is that, as I mentioned before, we can also imagine scenarios where people inject hardware Trojans in every integrated circuit that's being used in Samsung phones, in iPhone, something like that. And for instance, a privacy violation, right? And suddenly you get all kind of private data from maybe hundreds of millions of citizens worldwide, right? So I'm sure people are very eager to do that. We know Google and others have this data anyway, but we don't want to make matters worse. Okay, so this is this report that I mentioned. So this was issued in 2005 with the maybe not too specific title, High Performance Microchip Supply, and the underlying situation is that the vast majority of microchips are being manufactured abroad, right? Many of them in East Asia. That means everybody who is not in East Asia, you have some kind of foreign country, right, that is involved in that, right? As Lejla, when she generously introduced me, she talked about my history, right? So I started working in applied crypto and in hardware security in 2005. Like 2 years later, I got my first NSF grant on cryptography and FPGAs, which was a new topic back then, believe it or not. So, but until recently, 2007, I never heard about hardware Trojans. So what you see on the slides, so really this DoD report from the US triggered this research. What you see here are the papers that either in title or in the body of the paper actually deal with hardware Trojans, right? So they grew not exponentially, right? Not like the pandemic, but more or less linearly, right? And I should update these slides here. Right. So what I'm trying to say, many people are looking now into hardware Trojans, right? And it's maybe not that new of a topic, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So this was like, setting the stage, right? So maybe the next question would be more technical nature. So how do we really get hardware Trojans implemented, injected, right? Because this is different from software Trojan side, where you maybe have a malicious version of Microsoft Office or like, a PDF file that you somehow manipulated, right? So let's start with this. And I'm going to give you 4 scenarios, 4 ways we could introduce Trojans or Trojan-like manipulation. So this DoD report, and a lot of research is centering on that. This what you see as is what hardware people call a fab. So this is actually the factory where integrated circuits are baked, so to speak, right? And they've become extremely expensive. Many, 2-digit billion-dollar, right? So they're very expensive, right? And again, there are only a few of these high-end factories left that actually can manufacture in 7 nanometers or whatever state of the art, right? And they tend to be concentrated in certain countries, right? That means the whole world have to go to one of these few factories. And again, then there's the question, during manufacturing, can people alter with our chips, right? The other one, which is maybe one abstraction level up, is hostile hardware blocks. What are hostile hardware blocks? The fancy term is IP cores. So, if I look at my, I don't know, you see that, you see here my iPhone, right? If you look at the main integrated circuit, right, this is big. So this is probably approaching 1 billion transistors, right? And they're all kind of different functionality, right? There's probably our graphic accelerator, right, for run if you watch YouTube, this type of stuff. All kind of interfaces, Wi-Fi interface and bus drivers. And a lot of these hardware blocks, think of them as like software programs. They're not written by the Apple engineers themselves. They get them from externally. They buy them, and again, the fancy terms is IP cores. So, and we can imagine being Trojans inserted in these IP cores. There are rumors that are 100 or 200 IP cores in one of these high-end smartphones, not necessarily only Apple. I'm sure the same goes for Google phones, right, or Android telephones. So yet another even higher up level is during shipments, right? And there have been reports about that. So that people during shipment actually start swapping integrated circuit, right? You have the original circuit, which is Trojan-free, and then you have the Trojanized circuit, and during shipment, you intercept, right? And you swap them. And thirdly, kind of engineering-wise, the easiest task, arguably, is built in by manufacturer, and I'm going to come back to that. So what is kind of interesting so now is, so these are all more or less valid scenarios, right, that we can imagine. And there's some indication that people have done that. So who's going to do that here? So this is something, you know, like governments are worried about, right? They said, you know, don't put Trojans. This would be ways to Trojanize, for instance, military hardware, but also commercial hardware, critical infrastructure hardware. At the same time, we know from the Snowden documents that, again, we talk about governments do the other two attacks, right? They both intercept and like to convince hardware manufacturers to build in backdoors, right? So there's even a term for that. This is called interdiction. This photo was from a not very secret website. So this was from Wikipedia. If you go to the English language Wikipedia and you look up NSA, you find this picture there. So allegedly that was taken in some kind of secret NSA facility, and where people are opening up boxes, right, and swapping chips. I don't know whether it's true, right? I can only say what I find on Wikipedia. Okay, so that is maybe gives you a little bit high-level introduction where we are. So now it might be interesting. So do we have any kind of historical evidence? Right? So we go really way back. So World War II, and probably many of you have heard this whole Enigma story, right? Which is this perfect, exciting story, right? Alan Turing in England, and actually they initially got help by the Polish. Otherwise, it's arguable whether they would have succeeded with also Polish initial input by Polish mathematicians. So you know, they brought the Enigma machine, which was what's called a rotor machine. The Americans also used a rotor machine, but this was secure, so you couldn't break that with mathematical analysis, which was the M209 machine. You know, that was used for tactical communication in the field, right, during the war. And that was built by AB Kryptotechnik, which was a Swedish company, by Boris Hagelin, right? So he built that, and you know, some people joked he's the only person who ever got rich from selling cryptography, right? Cryptographic solutions, right? So what was interesting after Second World War, right? The Cold War started, right, between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, and people also used encryption machines. So one of that was the C52 encryption machine, which was built by Crypto AG, which had set up shop in Switzerland, beautiful Switzerland, which was owned by the same guy, by Boris Hagelin, who, you know, look up on the upper part of the slide, who used to sell equipment to the US government during World War II. So what happened is this Crypto AG, you know, this is a company that on the bottom here, right, that built this rotor machine. So there was a fairly big scandal coming out, namely, there is an alleged, and I think by now it's more than alleged, people are pretty sure that Crypto AG cooperated with Western intelligence services, namely, you know, NSA, the British, and the Bundesnachrichtendienst. This is our beloved German intelligence service, right? So, and what came out actually in around 1990, there was a language report by Der Spiegel, and also more recently in the US, I think by the Wall Street Journal. Again, similar story. Crypto AG sold encryption equipment which was Trojanized. That means which was backdoors, right? So that even you encrypted messages, you know, intelligence servers were able to break encryption, right? Yeah, and exactly this machine, there's strong indication that this was artificial weekend, right? Which is what we call a backdoor, maybe a Trojan. This is sometimes a little not quite clear, right? There was an interesting case. I don't know, probably not many people in that room remembered, but there was in 1986, there was a second-year undergraduate student back then, electrical engineering in Germany. There was a bombing in a discotheque in Berlin, which was frequented by US servicemen, by the US Army, because Berlin didn't fully belong to Germany back then, so it was still belonged to the four powers. And then Ronald Reagan, I think 5 days later, something like that, he sent cruise missiles to Libya and tried to kill Gaddafi. He failed. There are rumors that one of his relatives got killed by that, right? And then Ronald Reagan, who was the president, the US president at the time, he misspoke, because the question is, why did you bomb Libya if in Berlin, which is like 4,000 kilometers away, a bomb goes up in a discotheque? And he said, he misspoke. He said something like, we listened into communication between Libya, the Libyan government and the Libyan consulate in Berlin, right? So, and surprise, surprise, they used the crypto AG machine, right? So there's some indications that the Americans would break the crypto AG traffic, right? So another aspect of that was the export control, and that's probably people that have been doing crypto for more than 20 years remember that after the end of World War II, so during the Cold War, cryptography was classified essentially like ammunition, right? And there was a very strict export control law. And until the 1990s, you could only export crypto with 40-bit key, which is even back then was laughably insecure, right? And in 96, there were major relaxation of crypto export, but even that, the US government was very reluctant to do that. They did some crazy, Bill Clinton had tried some crazy things earlier than that. They tried to introduce a Clipper chip, which was not a proprietary cipher, but it was a US government cipher, I think with an 80-bit key. The whole idea was that every piece of equipment, every piece of hardware or software that used cryptography had to use this Clipper chip, and all the keys that being used in any product had to be escrowed with the US government. That means the US government had access to all the keys, and then there was this whole legal framework. If the terrorist or crime, whatever, big crime involved, then the US government could unseal that key and break the traffic. But there was a lot of international backlash, right? Because it would have given a lot of control to the US government, including from the EU, right? And arguably it was because there was such a backlash by the EU that the US dropped most, but not all, export control. Coming closer to 2021, right? In 2017, the Comey, the FBI director, he had this, I think there was an article in a political journal, he warned about going dark. He said, there's this, what we now would probably call end-to-end encryption, such as WhatsApp and Signal and so forth, right? We can't break that anymore. We can't break AES 256-bit, right? And it's terrible, terrorists are going to take over the world, and child pornography, blah, 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 which are not totally unvalid points, frankly, right? I think it's a difficult discussion, right? And then, of course, what the US government proposed, surprise, surprise, let's put in backdoors, right? And more recently, the big IT companies such as Apple, they're pushing really hard against it, right? And it has not happened as far as I know, right? What we do know, which goes along these lines, right, is a very elegant way of getting a backdoor into products is to Trojanize standards, right? And this is this famous famous leak in the Snowden papers, right? That the elliptic curve random number generator, right, is Trojanized, right? That means if you use this, which is a somewhat obscure random number generator, but if you use that, the US has a backdoor with deniability built in. And now coming very close to now, a big, very current question, ongoing question is, right? So we're not talking Cold War, right? 1950s or 80s, right? There's this big question is, in general, how trustworthy is communication and computer equipment that is not coming, from your own country, right? So there was this Bloomberg hack, and the jury is still out how real that is, right? But you see this tiny chip there, which is, and it's not clear, this is a mod chip, modification chip that actually did bad stuff in servers, or was it just a hardware fix, right? And a big discussion is right now going on, can we trust 5G 5G equipment coming from certain manufacturers, right? Huawei gets a lot of heat, but I'm sure that probably also the same backdoor story could happen to European manufacturers, right? If they build 5G. And in general, I find it's a very difficult question to deal with, right? What's a good solution? Is that right? Okay, so that was the easy part, right? So now you can go back to sleep. I start with my techie part. Now I want to give you 2 case studies, right? How to possibly build hardware Trojans that are pretty dangerous. Okay, so if German professors do that, it's typically their graduate students, right, and postdocs. So here Georg, Pavel, and Mark did much of the work I'm going to show on the next 2 slides. So despite this historical perspective, blah, 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 all the things that happened, what we don't have a really good example of like a real hardware Trojan that's widely reported, where we know all the details, right? There are plenty of examples, but they're done by people like me, or more like my students, right? They take an FPGA, you have your AES or ECC or whatever implementation, and you backdoor that. You build some key leakage functions, for instance, right? So, and it's questionable, are these Trojans that people like my students and I built, is this what powerful intelligence service would put in, right? And by the way, what I like is if you compare that situation with software Trojans, right? Malware, software malware, then we have the opposite problem, right? They're like the tens of thousands of new versions of malware released per day, right? So, and here with hardware Trojans, we're more or less down to 0, right? So it's a somewhat absurd situation, which is funny because we know as security researchers, our job is to do cryptanalysis, right? Penetration testing, find weaknesses, and once we find weaknesses, try to improve the systems, right? When in hardware Trojans, it has improved a little bit, but not that much. So, and you remember this earlier slide with these 2 curves. So we did like a publication analysis, right? So how many papers are out there? The vast majority, way over 90%, is focused on detection rather than building them. So, and then what Georg and I thought, and this is a few years ago, said, okay, rather than trying to detect Trojans, if people haven't looked into designing them, why don't we try to design them? And if you have full control over your design, right, you build a classical backdoor in a product that you design, it's not that challenging probably. So, we're researchers, so we came up with this additional assumption, this boundary condition, said, okay, let's try to build a hardware Trojan with the least amount of changes, with the smallest possible alterations. And I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides what I mean by that. So, and what we came up with, we call it the inverter Trojan, and we focus on a modern CPU. I always use Intel here. I'm going to explain why, but it's not restricted to Intel, right? So if you look into your Intel chip, if you really open that up, it looks, like a mess, there's metal layers, blah, 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 blah. At some point, if you drill down, almost literally, if you drill down, you see transistors. And out of transistors, we can build logical functions. And what you see here, probably the most basic element, the basic thing you can do is an inverter. This is a very complicated truth table, right? I'm joking, right? So if you put in from the left input a 0, the inverter turns it into a logical 1 and vice versa, right? And you need 2 transistors for that, right? And so our research challenge is, how can we manipulate a transistor or this part of the circuit, let's put, to get this very simple alteration, right? Instead of just inverting a signal, you get a constant one out, right? So in terms of functionality, this is almost boring, right? What you could do, how to achieve that? Well, what you could do pretty much along the line, what you see on the left-hand side, you could change one of these metal wires on your integrated circuit. They would have the drawback, you can see that, right? If you open up the chip, and if you actually, this is a military chip, people are going to do that. They open it up, they check whether all the metal lines are okay. You'll see, there's supposed to be transistor on this picture on the right. As you see, there's a metal line, so you would see that with a standard electron scanning microscope, right? So the question is, are there sneakier ways of doing that? And that's what you see on the next slide, namely here. So this is a transistor. So this is the thing with the yellow circle around here, right? So if you didn't study electrical engineering, this how it looks from the side, right? The green one is silicon, right? As in Silicon Valley, right? And then you have these p doping areas, and you have input, output, and the gate switch, right? And by the way, real transistors are not that big, right? They're not 20 centimeters on my computer screen, right? If Intel builds something in 7 nanometer technology, this is 7 nanometers. This is, I don't have that here. I think it's a 1/10,000th of a human hair. So this big green block is tiny, tiny. Right? So, and what you see here, if you do this type of semiconductor construction, you get a transistor, right? And PMOS transistor. It's called PMOS because the doping, the orange things there, right? The orange areas, they're positively doped with positive atoms. What you can do, you can n-dope it, right? So change the doping polarity, is still doping, but with the wrong doping atom, so to speak. And what you get, then you don't get the switch, which is controlled by the gate, but it's always connected. It's a closed switch, right? So, and you can do the same same with an NMOS transistor, right? So if you do that, I'm sorry, I skipped the wrong slides. I'm sorry. This is too bad. 1 second, bear with me. Can't believe it's happening. Okay, I know exactly what happened here. Okay, I'm continuing. I'm sorry, so I have to show you this here. This is missing. So you know, we have this with the PMOS transistor. You can do the same with the NMOS transistor, right? What you get this circuit, right? So this is a PMOS transistor, right? So the transistor is still there, so it still looks like a transistor, but this is the functional diagram. This is a closed circuit now. On the bottom, you can do the same with the NMOS transistor. The transistor is still there, but it's permanently open. So it's a closed switch and an open switch. Very importantly, how do we achieve that? We literally fiddled around with the atoms, right? We just changed the doping, right? That means this is almost impossible to see, right? And because, you know, if you go back to the previous slides, the doping areas, they are not orange and green in reality, right? There are few extra atoms injected in there, right? So this, it's extremely difficult to find, right? And then you get this change. Functionality is constantly 1, right? So the question we ask ourselves at this point, once we've done that, can the manipulation be detected? It's very hard. Let's summarize that. More importantly, maybe for us as security researcher, kind of the constructive fun starts. This is a simple, that's what semiconductor people call, you know, chip designer calls, this is a stuck at 1 fault, right? Rather than having this inverter where the, you know, if you toggle the input, you toggle the output toggles 2, this is the output would be stuck at 1, right? So how can you use that to build, you know, inject a security weakness? How to use that to build a meaningful Trojan, again, meaningful from an attacker's point of view. So we look again, go back to our Intel, and the high level story is now, we're for instance, we're not going after the AES implementation itself or the ECC or the TLS state machine, whatever, right? Rather, we go after the true random number generator, which is not everybody knows that, but all the, you know, modern CPUs have TRNGs on board, true random number generators, right? What are they used for? You can use them, for instance, for simulation, all kind of other application engineering, but in particular, you can also use it for generating your own secret cryptographic keys, right? For applications such as your web browsing, if you use PGP for email encryption, all kind of digital signatures, PDF signing type of things. But these are exactly the things that should go secure. That means these are exactly the applications that attackers may want to attack, right? They want to fiddle around with that. And then the big idea is, what can we do with this dopant Trojan if we focus on the TRNG? And I mentioned that earlier. So this attack, you know, we demonstrated because by example of the Intel TRNG, but that works against all TRNG. We just used the Intel because we had some, they had published some design internal. Okay, so how do modern random number generators work? They really have two modules. They have this entropy source on the top, and this is some analog type of circuitry. So they do coin tossing, so to speak, right? So they have some, based on physical randomness, they generate random or almost random zeros and ones. They work pretty well, but only pretty well. In particular, they're often not long time stable, right? So they might age, or I think in practice, I'm not totally on top of that, but I think in practice, the more pressing problem is that they might not work totally perfectly if they get warm, for instance, if they got hot, right? You might have a bias. Instead of 50-50 zeros on one, maybe you have 51% zeros and 49% one, something like that. For that reason, you do digital post-processing, which is some hash type of operation. And here, what you get out, you can use as a cryptographic key. Okay. So, and now the idea is in the regular operation, you get 2 to the 128 different keys because there are 128 output. And then the idea is to inject this Trojan not in the entropy source, which would maybe our natural inclination to go after the analog circuit itself, but rather let's go after the post-processing, right? And just as an example, it would be nice to manipulate the random number generator such that you get only 2 to the 32 keys, which is still 1 billion keys roughly. So a user wouldn't necessarily notice it right away, but a brute force attacker, if the brute force attacker knows all the 2 to the 32 keys, it takes like a matter of seconds, right, to brute force them. So how do we do that? Now we drill into this digital post-processing unit, and this is the part that was published by Intel, so we knew how Intel does that, right? So what they do, they use at the core the standard AES, and we know AES has two inputs, right? There's the key coming in, and there's the plain text coming in, right? So both the state K register and the cipher text register, not cipher text, the plain text register C, they're both being fed, the entropy source is feeding both the plain text input and the key input. And what you see, there is this counter mode, right? There's also an increment and an adder circuit there for the AES. And this is, for instance, used if the entropy source is not fast enough. Let's say as a user, you query constantly with, hundreds of megahertz, you query this TRNG. And even if the entropy source is too slow, then you run that in this adder mode here, right? So how many random inputs bits do we have? 256. So now if you want to brute force that baby, you get this 2 to the 250, or depending, you get at least 2 to the 128 different cryptographic keys, right? Can we brute force that? No, NSA can't do either, right? As far as we know, nobody in the world can do that, right? So this is way too big, right? You can do that, but that would be lifetime of the universe or something crazy. Right? So now what we do with our Trojan, you see that I changed the color of the bits, right? So most of the bits on the top, the input register to AES are red, right? 0 or 1. And what I mean by red is, so you manipulate it with this Trojan, with this doping manipulation. So these registers are constantly on 0 or 1, similar to the inverter we've seen, right? And what you see here, so most of the bits are fixed to 0 and 1. In this example, 224. But what you also see in black, we still remain 32 bits are still actually being loaded from your entropy source, from your analog type of circuit. And what happens then? Well, now you don't have 256 input bits, you only have 32. And then, of course, our lifetime of the universe key space is reduced to 2 to the 32, which is roughly 1 billion possible cryptographic keys, again, which you can test in not a fraction, but maybe a second or a few seconds on our laptops, right? So, and then this is now totally technical. So if you're not in hardware design, ignore this slide, please, right? I do apologize, right? So what they do is they do testing on chip. but there's on-chip testing. So they test, because what we do here, the question is that we force certain bits to 0 and 1, will that not be detected, right? And also we know how that works because it has been published. So how that works is you look the upper part of this drawing. So you give a known input, and this rate matcher, this is a fancy term for this AES I explained, right? This is scrambling thing. So with known input, you get 512 bits of output. And what you see on the bottom, if you Trojanize that, of course you get the wrong input, right? Because we fixed input, right? And the known input is hardwired by Intel, right? But what they want to avoid is that you check 512 bits bit by bit. It's just a lot of data to be checked and it needs to be stored. So the standard thing to do in VLSI design, you have a test mode, you compute a CRC checksum. That means you reduce your 512 bit to 32 bits, and now you're comparing the 32-bit checksum. And now what we can do, we can through some, and this you can read details in the paper, we can make sure even though the 512 bits, they're incorrect because we manipulated the input of AES, but we did this manipulation in a clever way such that after this compression with the CRC, after computing the checksum, the 32 bits are correct. That means this built-in self-test fails, right? Okay, and again, I don't want to go too much into detail, that would be too long. So what is the conclusion from this here? So this, we published that a few years ago, 2013, so more than a few years ago. We published that a while ago. And, press really picked that up. We got a lot of good press, right? And the big takeaway is, I think we showed you can do meaningful, meaning quite dangerous hardware Trojans without adding a single gauge, right? This is something you have to bear in mind. So we didn't add some kind of external hardware circuitry to do some key leakage, whatever, right? We just caused some mild incorrect behavior of the TRNG. I don't know most, but many detection techniques that have been proposed, they don't work. And that was our chess paper. What's interesting now, what's on the bottom of the slide is, so, some people say, oh, Christof, why are you going to propose that? It's really dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But again, I said that in the beginning, in passing, how does the scientific community work? Scientific community of us security researchers, we show these weaknesses and then people works on fixing, and the scientific community actually worked beautifully here because the team from Japan said, kind of cute work what Christof did, but this doping alteration, right? Swapping the N doping with a P doping, right? The switch from green to orange in that slide, right? That can be detected, right? So this is a scanning electron microscope, SEM, run of the mill, right? I mean, they're still expensive, but you can rent them in almost any university. And they could say, not that fast, Christof, right? We can, I mean, it's painful, but you can really detect this change in doping polarity. So that was kind of interesting. So now comes the second case study, which is a little bit faster. Another stealthy hardware Trojan, low-level hardware Trojan, okay? And now we go to this other big class of hardware devices, namely not, hardwired integrated circuit, but reconfigurable hardware, right? Which is they're called FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays. The two market leaders, so it's kind of it's maybe somewhat similar to AMD and Intel, right? So this is Xilinx and Altera. They have between 85 to 90% of the world market. A few years ago, they sold 5 billion devices, which is only a tiny, tiny chunk of the worldwide semiconductor market. But they tend to be in a lot of applications that are security sensitive, such as routers, right? At some point, I don't know whether it's true anymore, at some point, the biggest buyer of Xilinx chip was actually a big router company, right? But also in aerospace, in wireless equipment, in medical equipment. So these are all targets that could be interesting to hackers, right? So, and now comes kind of a quirky thing, which comes really as a surprise. So, if you buy at your favorite hardware supply website, if you buy an Altera or Xilinx chip, right? you would expect you get this chip. The chip itself is dumb. It has to be configured. I mean, they're dumb, but they're big, right? They have probably hundreds of millions of transistors. They're quite powerful. You can build very large circuits on them, right? They're dumb. They have to be configured, right? And what I always expected as an naive crypto engineer is, okay, let's store this configuration information on chip, but that doesn't work for technological reasons. And again, I'm not going to detail why this is not happening. Rather, it's stored externally on a flash, right? That means on the motherboard, pretty much as you see in the picture, at some location, you have your Altera chip, and the other, you have your memory chip. And how do you get the information in? Very simple, literally doing power up. So if you flip the switch on your router, you load in 10 million bits. This is roughly the size of a bit stream, and this 1 million bits, configure all the different circuits and lookup tables and multipliers and stuff to make this the FPGA work, right? Also means if you need it, for instance, to accelerate crypto, such as AES, which is actually any block cipher, almost all symmetric ciphers, they benefit from hardware acceleration, right? They're very well suited for hardware acceleration, right? Factor between a factor 10 and 100 or something like that, and maybe factor 1,000 energy savings, right? So that means if you want to realize, for instance, AES in hardware in your FPGA, of course you have to describe AES in your bit stream, right? There must be some encoding, right, to realize AES here, right? So what Pavel and I thought a few years ago, would it be possible to build a hardware Trojan by manipulating the bit stream? There's this big advantage as being, if you're a PhD student or professor like me, you can do that in your lab, right? The other Trojan I showed, which was targeting Intel, of course we didn't buy, right? Intel would not cooperate with us, unfortunately, right? So the idea that we have, the type of Trojan, before we manipulated the TRNG, we do something different here, namely we go after the actual crypto, right? And the idea is, so we look at an AES implementation, and we want to do, again, conceptually something simple. We want to replace the standard AES, and what you see on the right-hand side is AES with the thread T, and T stands for Trojan. So we want to replace the original AES with a Trojanized version of AES, such that we can break it. Maybe key extraction, I'm going to show you in a couple of slides how to do that, right? And what you have to do with that, you see this red frame with the bits, right? You have to alter bits in this bit stream, right? On your flash chips, right? You have to alter that, right? So the first thing we have to do is to find that. And it turns out to be a pretty tricky undertaking, because in practice, you would get a router, or you would get some FPGA in a car or in an airplane. You would get this bit stream without any description, right? And they're actually proprietary, so we don't really, or mostly proprietary, so we don't really know the meaning of the bits. That means you have 10 million bits, maybe a few 10 million bits, and 8,000 of them describe your AES. Good luck, right? So first of all, we have to find them, and then we have to manipulate them the right way. So, and then we worked really hard on doing that. And what turns out to be what's a gift from heaven is, if you have symmetric ciphers, in particular block ciphers that are S-box based, which is state of the art, the S-boxes are very specific, very pathological from a logic point of view, right? That means the logical function that's realized by an S-box is very extreme, and it has to do that you need high degree of nonlinearity. So we exploited that in an earlier paper. And what we did to verify our results, so we looked at 8 AES implementations, which they were not coming from us, right? So we found them on the internet, and they all kind of, you can ignore the table pretty much. So these are 8 different AES implementation on FPGAs, of course. What's important is the rightmost column. In each of this implementation, we were able to find the S-box, right? And again, it has to do with this very specific type of contents, right? So, which is, if you think about it, it's not that complicated. Still, it's like 1 year of research by a PhD student or an MS student, right? So, and now I'm almost coming to the end. So what we've done so far is something not that earth-shattering, right? So we were able to find the S boxes. So what we can do now, and this assumes the attacker gets hold of the device for a moment, right? Maybe for 5 minutes you get hold on a router, right? So what the adversary can do now, the attacker can replace the bit stream in this flash chip, which is external. You know, the big silver thing which says vertex 4 is the FPGA, but on some other chip on that board you have your flash. So we can alter the flash contents, right? So that it describes a trojanized AES. What you do then, you flip the device on, right? And then you configure the AES, but the trojanized version. Trojanized means it's a weak AES. For instance, what you can do, which is very easy, you place the original AES box with very specific mathematical properties so that it's cryptographically strong with the identity, right? So 8-bit in, out, and the same 8-bit are being forwarded, right, through the S box, right? So what you can do then as an attacker, you can feed plain text. You receive ciphertext that's encrypted, but again, you know, this is kind of cute what we're doing. You encrypt, but not with the original AES. That's the whole point, right? With this weakened, right, which is this trojanized AES. And here you can make a point. Well, this is of very limited use, Christof, right? Because you in particular, this is not interoperable. So what you cannot do, use that is an SSL connection, TLS connection, encrypt traffic, send it over the internet on the receiving side is being decrypted because it doesn't decrypt correctly, right? Because we not used AES. And we were unhappy about it. We knew that from the beginning. So and then the question is, how can we still use it for attacks? And I think we have two use cases. And the first one is maybe the most convincing one, I find. So what are possible attacks? So the first one is this very setting that you use an FPGA as an AES, as an encryption accelerator, is very attractive for cloud computing, right? You know, cloud is a big thing, is cloud security, how secure is our data in the cloud. So what you can do is you encrypt everything in the cloud, right? And then what happens is, so if you write stuff into your cloud, it's being encrypted. If you read it out, it's decrypted. It's not very complicated. For us, the nice thing for us as, you know, hardware Trojan designers, encryption and decryption works with the same algorithm. Right? For instance, with this very FPGA you see here. So what we could do here, we could inject this Trojan. So we replace original AES with a weak AES. What is going to happen now is it's being, when you store data, it's being encrypted, but with a weak version of AES. When you read out, it's decrypted with a weak version of AES. So from a user perspective, everything works fine. Now, if you're an attacker, if you're National Intelligence Service, you get hold of the ciphertext, but now you can decrypt because it was only weakly encrypted, right? So this is pretty dangerous, right? And another added advantage is if you just look at the plain ciphertext, it looks like random data, right? Because we still encrypt, but just in a weak way. Attack number 2 is quite different. This is used for key extraction. So this is a different scenario. Let's say you get hold of your router, or maybe an airplane is a good example. And let's assume there's some secret key burned into your software, burned into the hardware, right? Or maybe in the software, right? There's this one master key you want to get out, right? What works with this key, you do exactly what you see on the slide. You configure the trojanized AES. You send plain text in, you get ciphertext out here, right? What you do now with the ciphertext, you just do a classical cryptanalysis to extract the key, which you can do because this is a very weak version of AES. And when you do that, you suddenly have the key. So this would be a very elegant way, if you wish, to extract the key, which is maybe much easier than extracting the key by side channel analysis if there is a side channel resistant AES implementation or fault injection or whatever, right? So that can be a very easy way to get hold of a key. The only thing you need, you have to access the device for 5 minutes or something like that. So this is pretty much my last slide here. So what we showed here, I think this is kind of interesting. So this is a new attack vector against FPGAs, which is interesting because a lot of people have expertise worldwide in crypto and FPGAs. From a methodological point of view, this is really great because we can do that in the lab, right? So we actually demonstrated that, right? And again, unlike this Intel Trojan that we proposed, which we a doping Trojan, we cannot do that. Of course, the counter argument is, well, but this is only if the bit stream is actually in there in the clear. What happens if you do bit stream encryption? Yeah, and the big vendors, including Altera and Xilinx, they do offer bitstream encryption, but there's this whole series of paper where people break bitstream encryption. Usenix 2020, we got a big best paper award. It's somewhat different. It's not best paper award. It's honoring, mentioning, whatever. At Usenix, where we broke yet again certain FPGA bitstream encryption. So it seems an easy problem. In practice, it's very hard. That meaning like the most obvious countermeasure is pretty hard to do. That's what I'm trying to say. So, and that was published in 2015, and we have a little bit some updates on that. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my talk. If you're interested, so what you're seeing, even though we do hardware security, at the end, most of my work has some relationship to applied crypto. So if you're interested in applied crypto, you can buy my book, but you don't have to, because you can watch my lectures for free on YouTube, where I teach, 80% of the book contents, right, which is quite popular by people. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christof. Thanks for the talk. Let's see if we have some questions from the audience.
Hi, Christof. Very nice talk.
Thank you.
So I have like one question regarding the first Trojan. Is the Trojan always active? Because I do not see any triggered circuit that you talked about in the design.
So the first one is always active, and it's kind of the beauty with that, because you just fiddle around with the two random number generators. That means it's not that disturbing, if you use it from an attacker's point of view, right? Because you just reduce the entropy, right? So from a user perspective, it's always happening. But you're right, there's no trigger in it, right? So that means every device that we manipulate it that way actually has that problem that that you're running it with reduced entropy. Yeah.
Okay, so that
was a good observation. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. You see it, Christof, or should I read it?
No, I can look. So this is
so from Anna first.
Okay, Anna. Is it really possible to block these very clever and advanced spywares like Pegasus using hardware? Also, is that the question, whether I can whether we can block Pegasus using hardware? The answer is I don't know. I'm not good at software security. I'm sure there are much smarter people in this room. I'm really sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. I go off to Fabio's question. Thank you. How do you use this positive and negative impact of open hardware movements on hardware security? So the question is, there is this slow movement towards open hardware, and one of the arguments in favor of that is it's more secure because we have more control over the design. I think it's not the silver bullet, right? Because you can still Trojanize AES, and we had a chess paper on that, right? And then last year we also had an S&P paper on that. But I think it's a step up, because at least on the design level, you can check whether the design that's going in, right, the HDL type of design, right, hardware description language design, you can actually check that much more easily whether it's Trojan-free or not. So I think that's an improvement. You still have to watch out what happens during manufacturing, but maybe we can deal with that. So I think, again, it doesn't solve all the solution, but it's maybe a step in the right direction, I think. Yeah. Good, very good remark, Fabio.
Thanks. There is also here a short question from Johan.
Yes, hello, Christof. I understood that the FPGA producers, they protect the bit stream by encryption, but it's actually, they want to protect integrity, right? So you would expect them to use a signature. So say signature verification is quite light, huh? With a small modulus, a small public exponent.
Yeah.
Do that?
Yeah, they're using. Your question is why they're not doing that?
Yeah, because if they would sign it with RSA, then I don't see how you can substitute something in the bitstream.
No, absolutely, they're doing that with more common is actually a MAC, so with symmetric, but you can also do it, of course, asymmetric. They do it both. What I said in passing towards the end, we broke many of these schemes with things such as side channel attacks. Yeah, but RSA verification, there is no secret, huh? So that's the okay, yeah. That's a good point. I think most existing schemes are not using asymmetric cryptography. That's a good point, actually. They use symmetric, and then, of course, you got a secret key, of course. That's stupid, huh? No. Which is hard, right? Well, but even that, they're pretty big companies, and you would think they have resources to build something secure, but it turns out to be, I find a surprisingly hard problem to do that. I know that at least Xilinx devices that use RSA, but actually in the last attacks that we published last year, they had a protocol failure in. We didn't even use side channel attacks. Yeah, typical. They had a hardwired, So, but, it's incredible, But you have a good point. So in theory, we should be able to solve that. And actually, my prediction is sooner or later that will be solved. That it will be that we will have strong cryptography on FPGAs. Probably at some point my group has to stop publishing about that because we can't detect them anymore. Yeah. Because it's 2021. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks. It's very nice talk. Yeah. But there's also a legacy problem, right? You have all these products in with old FPGAs, blah blah blah, right? And even if the modern FPGAs out, it's a pain to swap, redesign PCBs, blah 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 blah. Yeah, like the bank's still on triple DES, right? Yeah. Okay, good question though. Yeah.
So I think we've come to the end of this session. So thanks, Christof. Thanks a lot. Round of applause for Christof. At least virtual. So